What did a man with a rifle in his hands really experience when he found himself inside the bloodiest war in US history? Make yourselves comfortable, friends. Over the next couple of minutes we'll talk about this, bust a couple of myths along the way, and tell you about one of the defining conflicts in US history. We'll walk this path together with our guest, James Brown. It is the year 1863, and the war that began in 1861 and would end in 1865 is in full swing. To understand its scale, let us remind you that this conflict became the bloodiest in the history of the American continent. About 5 million soldiers passed through the jaws of war, 1/6 of the US population at the time. The number of victims exceeded 1 million, which is twice as many as in the far more famous Crimean War. In short, the Civil War was terrifying, bloody, and, most importantly, fundamental. Our James Brown is a soldier of the Confederate States of America, also widely known as the South. The Confederate States were a collective name for a state that during the Civil War was de facto independent. Moreover, the South's independence was recognized by Britain and France. It all began with 6 southern states which, with the accession of Texas on March 2, 1861, declared their secession from the United States of America. Later, the total number of Confederate states would reach 13. The reason for their secession was the policy of the new U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln. As a Republican, he fiercely opposed slavery, which formed the backbone of the southern states' economy. In fact, not only the southern states, but the U.S. economy as a whole. In 1860, the South produced 75% of American exports, the main commodity of which was slaves. Altogether, they were worth more than all the factories, plants, and ports of the nation combined. Unsurprisingly, any encroachment on slavery became a red line for the South. At this point, most sources, without much thought, name slavery as the main cause of the war. Of course, this is a mistake. The situation is best described by Lincoln's own words in the New York Tribune. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." In short, Lincoln did not particularly care about slaves. What interested him, and the North as a whole, were taxes, and whether people were slaves or not was irrelevant in that regard. The North wanted to retain control over the South, while the South wanted to preserve its way of life and not allow residents of other states to dictate their will. That is how James Brown and another 1.2 million Southern men found themselves on the front lines. Here we encounter another myth, that Southerners were plantation-owning slaveholders, while the Northern Army was diverse in skin color, age, and social status. Ironically, reality was almost the opposite. Clear statistics show that the average age of a Union soldier was 21, and the overwhelming majority were white farmers conscripted through mobilization. Meanwhile, the South assembled the most diverse crowd imaginable. In his memoirs, one Confederate commander, Robert Watson, marveled at how different his subordinates were: Poles, Swedes, Irish, Brazilians, Portuguese, Germans, and Englishmen, just part of the diversity Watson described. Ironically, ideas of equality and brotherhood during the Civil War were more characteristic of the slaveholding South than of the North. Equality, of course, came with the caveat that a white person always stood above a black person. However, there is another myth here: the situation in the Union Army was exactly the same. Racism and segregation in the United States were only defeated in the second half of the 20th century, so it is naive to believe articles claiming there was no discrimination in the Northern Army during the Civil War. Those were simply the morals of the era. And the North opposed slavery not out of kindness either. Unlike the agriculturally rich South, the North focused on industry, where slave labor was useless, skilled workers were needed. The invisible hand of the market swept people in regardless of skin color. But let us return to our James Brown. Theodore Hirsch has an excellent book about the everyday life of ordinary Civil War soldiers, in which he repeatedly notes that the main problem for soldiers was not combat, but disease. Malaria, pneumonia, and tuberculosis literally claimed more lives than all the battles combined. Among the Confederates, for example, 94,000 men were killed in combat over 4 years of war, while 164,000 died from disease in the same period. We should not forget that this was the mid-19th century. Concepts such as field medicine and sanitation already existed,
but the full transformation of armies was still far away. This applied to daily routine as well. The 19th century was an era of elegant marching formations and tactical maneuvers involving tens of thousands of troops. The aforementioned Robert Watson literally describes the grueling routine of a common soldier: wake up at 5 a.m., breakfast, drill, weapons inspection, joint drills with another regiment, lunch, drill, evening drill, dinner, drill, and sleep. There is nothing to add, a soldier had to be constantly ready. Recruits noted that the hardest part of the war was the first weeks, when drill was virtually the only thing on the schedule. Why did James Brown need all this at all? This, friends, is yet another myth. Southerners were not slaveholders dying for the right to own slaves, just as Northerners were not dying to free them. Most had their own motivations, which were especially evident in the diverse Confederate Army. Guy Taylor, a soldier of the 36th Brigade from Wisconsin, explained his motivation in a letter to his wife with one word: freedom. Almost certainly, 9 out of 10 soldiers would have said the same, regardless of whether they fought for the North or the South. It was just that everyone understood freedom differently, something characteristic of any war. Another defining feature was the dominance of infantry on the battlefield. From the end of the Middle Ages to this day, infantry has determined the outcome of battles. The Civil War had cavalry and artillery, but 75% of the Confederate Army were infantrymen, and over 90% of all battle wounds were caused by small arms fire. At first glance, soldiers' rifles of the era did not differ much from the muskets of the Napoleonic Wars, but only at first glance. By the 1860s, both sides were well equipped with rifled barrels, meaning range and accuracy were close to modern standards. Rate of fire, however, still left much to be desired. 10 shots in 5 minutes was considered standard for a trained soldier. James Brown fights with an Enfield rifle, proven during the Crimean War. It was not the fastest weapon, but it was reliable and deadly. Aimed fire allowed shooting at distances up to 800 meters, and the bullets tore bodies apart. There were no conventions banning mutilating ammunition at the time, which, combined with poor field medicine, made being hit by a bullet almost a death sentence. The North preferred Springfield rifles, as well as some of the first repeating carbines in history. The Spencer carbine was a revolutionary weapon, firing 7 rounds in 7 seconds, but it did not have a decisive impact on this particular conflict, just like bayonets, whose use was gradually fading. The very concept of rifled barrels implied minimal close combat. As a result, only 922 people died from bayonet wounds during all 4 years of the Civil War, and a significant portion of those deaths occurred in drunken brawls or riots. Like any large-scale conflict, this war became a teaser for future technologies. Southern soldiers were the first to use land mines, artillery shells with fuses buried in the ground. The technology, however, was crude. The North solved the problem simply by sending captured Confederates to clear the mines, as they knew how they worked. Grenades also began to be used, the so-called Ketchum and Excelsior grenades. These were also modified artillery explosives, but they were used rarely because they often exploded in the hands of those throwing them. The conflict would end in defeat for our James Brown and the South. Today it is often described as if inspired Northerners, fighting for the noble cause of abolishing slavery, left the demoralized South no chance. This, of course, is the result of history being written by the victors. In reality, the beginning of the war favored the South. It had a more experienced officer corps, and the wealth of local slaveholders allowed the army to be supplied at the highest level. The turning point came with 2 events in 1863. Lincoln resorted to a controversial move by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The measure was aimed at undermining the South from within, and it worked. Many black people began fleeing their owners, and European powers that had abolished slavery long ago started sending aid and resources in large quantities. The second turning point occurred on the battlefield. From July 1 to July 3, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg thundered. It ended in a draw, but for the South, which had been winning up to that point, this draw was tantamount to defeat. From that moment on, the Confederacy lost the initiative, and the North began dictating the terms. The final nail in the South's coffin was the enormous gap in human and industrial resources. The Union Army was twice as large, had many times more factories, and 3 times as many railroads. Logistics, manpower, and industrial capacity left the South no chance. However, total casualties were higher on the Union side, 640,000 dead compared to fewer than 500,000 in the South. Other metrics also largely favored the Confederacy, but this could not help, because progress, Europe, and new social ideas that attracted people were on the North side. On that note, we will wrap up. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. See you next time, friends.